This book series is about the evolution of meaning. But what exactly is meaning? What does it really entail for something to be meaningful? Is it something purely subjective, relative, just a matter of taste or opinion? Or is anything ever objectively meaningful, inherently meaningful, necessarily so? Clearly, meaning matters to people. Psychological research over the past few decades has revealed a direct association between people's sense of meaning in their lives and their overall health and well-being. A perceived lack of it leads to pathology and, in extreme cases, suicide. Meaning, then, has real existential import. But is this just a preoccupation of humans, perhaps only overly reflective modern ones? Or do other animals experience a sense of meaning? Is there meaning for a tree or a rock? What is the meaning of meaning? Comprehensive treatment of the evolution of meaning invites a consideration of etiologies and origins. And while this book series will focus primarily on human meaning and its transformations, I think it is vital to contextualize that focus by establishing the deep continuity that exists between human meaning and meaning more broadly. To that end, this book will consider meaning in its most fundamental terms, then follow this through line up to the domain of meaning in culture. Here I will attempt an excavation of meaning to its deepest strata. Such an archaeology can allow us to trace the idea of meaning back far before human society and even before animal cognition or biological evolution. Meaning, I will argue, arises out of the most fundamental dynamics of the physical world: energy and information. Indeed, bold as it may sound, it is precisely via the thermodynamic forces driving cosmic evolution as a whole that meaning evolves into more complex biological and social registers such as we experience as conscious agents. Meaning is a particular kind of information, namely information linking entities with their environments in ways that causally impact their viability and flourishing. Meaning is existential then, indeed. Beginning with a consideration of energy and information at the most basic level, we will turn to developments in information theory that have helped clarify the nature of meaningful information specifically. I will then track the implications of this idea into the big history frameworks that map cosmic complexification, arguing that meaning itself evolves through new emergent planes of existence, from matter to life to mind and on into culture. As entities acquire meaningful knowledge through novel information processing systems at each of these levels, they engage in an ongoing learning process underway in the universe, a learning process, in fact, that characterizes all levels of cosmic evolution. After we get a sense of the full scope of this learning process, we can begin to zoom in on the cultural plane specifically to examine the evolution of human meaning with particular attention to evolving conceptions of the sacred. But first, the basics. Energy and information. There is a fundamental property of the universe that literally informs, i.e. gives form to, all known phenomena. This is the all-important second law of thermodynamics. According to this law, nature tends toward equilibrium and the homogenization of differences in the cosmos. Heat dissipates, gradients dissolve, and things fall apart. Distinct differences are inherently unstable and will face the natural push to even out. For indeed, this push is precisely how energy does its work. To picture this dynamic, consider what happens when you pour cream into your morning cup of coffee. It naturally diffuses, mixing with the coffee in the cup so that the ordered distinction between cream and coffee gradually disappears, and both become inextricably mixed up. This is akin to the way energy in a system will dissipate and yield to entropy. This natural tendency toward homogeneity was given a statistical account by the physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who showed that the spontaneous trend toward equilibration could be understood in probabilistic terms. That is, in a system with many possible microstates, highly ordered, for example concentrated ones, are simply far less likely than the vast range of ways they can be disordered. Entropy, in this sense, can be understood as the gravitation towards randomness, and equilibrium arises when chance and probability are the only structuring pressures on a system. Now, if this entropic drift were the only dynamic operating in the universe, no structures or complex phenomenon would ever even form. There would only be static equilibrium forever. Fortunately, this is not the case. Instead, ordered structures can arise, but only if they are able to leverage the necessary energy to push back against the draw of entropy and maintain their improbable order. To make a common comparison, your house will tend to get messier and messier over time unless you make some effort to tidy up and organize it. There are a million places your dishes can be, so a clean kitchen means resisting that natural draw toward randomness and exerting yourself to ensure their configuration is in fact constrained to a very improbable range of overall possible states. Without that expenditure of energy, disorder will gradually increase, and eventually you will find yourself living in chaos. Things will mix and blend and blur unless some energy is expended to keep entities distinct and give things form. The same idea applies to information. Let's say your coffee mug has gone missing despite your best efforts to keep things organized. If I tell you it's not in the bathroom sink, you'll see that this fact is not at all that informative. Why? Because there are so many places it could be that it not being in any one of them is actually highly probable. It would be different if the mug could only be in, say, one of two possible places. Then knowing it is not in the bathroom sink would be incredibly informative. But with more possible states, there is more uncertainty and thus more ignorance. If you told me, however, that my mug is in the bathroom sink, you will have conveyed a considerable amount of information indeed, since you will have narrowed down the vast range of possible facts to a single fact, the needle in the haystack of possible states. In short, the more improbable the outcome, the more informative. This is basically the insight Claude Shannon offered that helped connect Boltzmann's notion of entropy to information. If I roll two dice, one with 6 sides and one with 600, the outcome of the die with 600 will yield more bits of information, since the alternative number of outcomes was greater. A clean kitchen is quite informationally rich, as there are many, many places my dishes could be, but only a small improbable subset in which they actually belong. Achieving that informational richness requires an expenditure of energy. And to be sure, a bigger kitchen or a more elaborate configuration of dishes would require even more energy. In sum, entropy jumbles distinct informationally rich configurations, but energy can be deployed to push back against entropic randomization, maintaining order and information in the face of dissolution. When it does, differences are established and distinction is allowed to persist. The second law thus creates a fundamental necessity for any entity that would exist in the universe. It must utilize free energy to maintain itself in the face of entropy. That is the veritable prime directive for anything to be. That is, for anything to exist, it must resist annihilation. This seeming tautology is actually quite profound, as it provides a minimal explanation for the existence of everything in the universe. It is the basic logic that informs all the complex phenomenon that we see around us. Form requires energy to inform it, and the more structurally complex something is, the more energy it needs to resist the entropic draw toward formless equilibrium. In the context of me and my kitchen, I am the means by which the energy is being exerted to counter entropic disruption. The energy needed to keep the kitchen organized cannot come from the system of the kitchen itself, since energy in an isolated system entropically degrades according to the second law and loses the ability to do work. Rather, the kitchen is an open system, with energy flowing into it from the outside to do the work required to keep it organized and informationally rich. Only open systems can resist entropic dissolution in this way. For instance, if you added hot water to the isolated system of a thermos of cold water, thermal equilibrium is inevitable. The energy will equilibrate and homogenize in accordance with the second law. Why? Because there is no additional energy available to do the work of keeping them distinct. If improbable configurations require energy to be sustained, then that energy will need to come from outside of the system. All things that exist, then, exist in relationship to the energy dynamics of their environment. All systems are systems in context. Indeed, without an energetic background context to distinguish and inform it, there could be no system. As Santa Fe Institute's David Krakauer and colleagues frame this relationship through their information theory of individuality, systems are defined by their environments through a figure-ground style distinction. Both represent information that bears on one another. Environments, E, influence systems, S, systems influence their environments, and each influences itself over time. Put in informational terms, there is a continual exchange of information from environment to system, from system to environment, from past to future states of the environment, and from past to future states of the system. The fidelity with which an informational individual preserves its informational distinction over time defines an enduring entity relative to its entropic and fluctuating environment. But maintaining that informational integrity requires successful communication between entity and environment, wherein information must also be faithfully conveyed. Information and meaning. Just because information is being conveyed between a system and its environment doesn't tell us anything about its meaning, though. Shannon's formulation of information dealt with informational quantification and accuracy, but remained entirely mute on how to assess whether information was actually significant to an entity, whether it was important or of value to some system in some context. But that is precisely the sort of meaning that we are interested in here. According to Shannon, I could send you an email containing billions of completely random numbers, and so long as you accurately received what I sent, you had gained a good amount of information. Clearly, this is a very impoverished notion of information. It ignores the crucial question of what information is about, what it might be for, and thus its semantic significance. Recently, however, complexity theorists have been able to fill in what's missing from this incomplete account. Specifically, they have identified how to articulate meaning within information theoretical terms. If entities are defined as stable transmissions of information through time, then continued, accurate transmission has intrinsic significance to the entity that is so informed. Some information transmission has an existential import. Likewise, when the information identifying an entity requires energy from the environment with which it is coupled to be sustained, then information about the environment must not only be accurate but helpful. That is, it must convey information about the environment in a manner that can be of use to sustaining the information that defines the entity. These sorts of ideas can be framed in the language of information theory. Specifically, because systems exist in environments, the information between them is correlated. Information about the state of the system directly relates to the information about the state of its environment and vice versa. This coupling of information between system states and environmental states is called mutual information, since it entails a statistical correlation between the two. Now, as we have seen, maintaining information requires energy. For a system to resist entropy and maintain itself, it must acquire this needed energy from its environment. Information from the environment can be relevant to that end or not. Indeed, there can be all sorts of information conveyed in Shannon's sense. What determines its true relevance, however, is adjudicated by how the mutual information of the system-environment relationship directly influences the system's continued existence. That is, at the most fundamental level, mutual information can be meaningful to the extent it causally impacts the specific existential requirements of a thing in context by helping it resist entropic breakdown. Only when information contributes to the capacity of something to continue existing in the face of entropy does it acquire meaning to that thing. This is what information can be about. When it is, the information is called meaning. Complexity scientists Artemy Kolchinsky and David Wolpert have been key to developing information theory in this way, allowing us to account for this sort of meaning and relevance mathematically. In a 2018 paper, they differentiate the specific kind of inherently meaningful information as true semantic information. Shannon information theory, they write, provides various measures of so-called syntactic information which reflect the amount of statistical correlation between systems. By contrast, The concept of semantic information refers to those correlations which carry significance or meaning for a given system. Kolchinsky and Wolpert thus assess meaning as arising out of the system-environment relation, and so offer a theory of semantic information that is based purely on the intrinsic dynamics of a system in a given environment. Information is meaningful for an entity to the degree that it assists in helping it resist entropy. As they put it, we define semantic information as the syntactic information that a physical system has about its environment which is causally necessary for the system to maintain its own existence. At the most basic level, then, environmental information causally tied to a system's informational persistence is a special kind of information that we can call meaning. Meaningless information, by contrast, offers nothing to an entity's continuation. Expending energy attending only to meaningless information about the environment extracts a true cost from an entity and is therefore existentially hazardous. If investments of energy into gaining information do not yield returns of energy commensurate with the expense, the entity risks entropic dissolution. Thus, Kolchinsky and Wolpert note, there is a connection between paying attention to the right information, as measured by semantic efficiency, and being thermodynamically efficient. Meaning, they say, increases a system's viability. By viability, though, they are not just referring to living systems. Kolchinsky and Wolpert's theory of semantic information is truly generalizable in that it applies not only to living beings but also any physical system, whether a rock, a hurricane, or a cell. All things face entropy. The viability of some entities is simply more sensitive to environmental conditions than others, but all are susceptible to annihilation. Meaning, it seems, has a truly expansive sense that can refer even to non-biological entities, a point we shall repeatedly return to. In sum, Kolchinsky and Wolpert's work, along with that of physicists like Carlo Rovelli, reveal that information can be useful or useless, relevant or irrelevant, about something important, or a harmful waste of time and energy. Information is relevant if it gives an entity causal power to maintain itself in its environment. Such information is then meaningful information, which emerges through the impinging of reality on agent behavior, which must adapt to its conditions to maintain its continued existence. Once we appreciate these fundamental dynamics about how systems relate to meaningful information in context, we can begin to understand the universal importance of learning. Semantic information theory lies at the heart of neuroscientist and science writer Bobby Azarian's integrated evolutionary synthesis, a key component of his ambitious unifying theory of reality, which sees the whole of cosmic evolution as one great learning process, unfolding across multiple levels of emergence. Linking theories like universal Darwinism, universal Bayesianism, evolutionary theory, and evolutionary epistemology into a single meta-theory, Azarian's integrated evolutionary synthesis identifies the processing of semantic information as the basis of knowledge creation across all scales of evolution. Essentially, it is the driving logic of how all things persist, diversify, and grow. As he puts it in his 2022 book, The Romance of Reality, How the Universe Organizes Itself to Create Life, Consciousness, and Cosmic Complexity, what is the foundation for a non-reductionist theory of everything? To understand the nature of life and the nature of reality, we must begin with what many scientists consider to be the law of all physical laws, the second law of thermodynamics. The natural tendency toward decay and disorder described by Boltzmann's statistical vision of the second law, which can be summed up as things fall apart. It gives any conceivable adaptive or sentient system an eternal existential challenge. Biologists call it survival, cyberneticists call it persistence, and physicists call it staying far from thermodynamic equilibrium. To stay far from equilibrium, in other words, to continue to exist, a system must be able to extract free energy from a noisy, fluctuating, ever-changing environment. This is no trivial task. In fact, it absolutely requires that life acquire information about the world it inhabits. This information has intrinsic meaning to a system because it is causally necessary for its continued existence. Due to its inherent meaningfulness, this kind of information has been called adaptive information. Because adaptive information reduces environmental uncertainty, or Shannon entropy, which is a technical term for ignorance, we also call it knowledge. As entities complexify, they become more adept at processing meaningful information from their environments. Expressed in concise terms, life's thermodynamic imperative necessitates knowledge accumulation. What Azarian calls knowledge here, I will call meaning, or meaningful knowledge when appropriate, following Kolchinsky, Wolpert, Ravelli, and others. That is the sort of information that has true relevance and significance for an entity, knowledge with causal power on the continued viability and flourishing of systems in contexts. And why exactly? Some basic philosophical reflection on this idea reveals it to be both tautologically simple yet existentially profound. Without meaning, an entity would cease to exist, such that there would be nothing to speak of, nothing to consider. There would be no information about it at all, nothing to distinguish it, nothing to define it. If meaning is information that is relevant to the robust continuance of an entity, then the very fact that anything exists entails the existence of meaning. For a thing to be entails that it has meaning. From the very logic of semantic information, such as Kolchinsky and Wolpert articulate, it is clear that entities more effective at attending to meaningful information will be more viable and thus more evolutionarily successful. There is then a natural evolutionary incentive for entities to acquire increasing information about themselves and their environment in furtherance of this process. More information processing capacity, though, requires entities that are themselves more informationally rich. As this feedback cycle unfolds, entities complexify, which both demands and occasions access to still more energy from the environment. And with energy increasingly needed to sustain such high informational order in the face of entropy, the energy-information cycle perpetuates itself. When we appreciate that one, entities exist, i.e. they faithfully convey their informational identity into future states, through correlation with the information of environmental contexts, i.e. mutual information, and 2, this correlation is the basis of meaning, and 3, entities are complexifying via this informational exchange, then we are led to an interesting conclusion, namely that meaning itself must be complexifying. Meaning and complexification. If energy, information, and structural order are indeed all related, then we should expect to see a clear correlation between these measures in a complexifying universe. As entities move further from equilibrium, they should require more energy to sustain their informational richness and organizational depth. That is, we should expect to find greater energy flows per increasing measure of structural complexity. And indeed, this is precisely what the calculations reveal. In his book Cosmic Evolution, The Rise of Complexity in Nature, physicist Eric Chaisson charts the universe's trajectory toward greater complexity by mapping these interrelated measures across big history. In full accordance with the second law, he writes, "The growing departure from thermodynamic equilibrium allows the cosmos to produce increasing amounts of net entropy and macroscopic information. We thereby have a means to appreciate in the main, if perhaps not yet to understand the particulars, the observed rise in complexity throughout the eons of cosmic evolution. From an initial state of homogeneity soon after the Big Bang, the universe began to self-organize and complexify." Chaisson's graphs all show a cosmos moving further from equilibrium, with entities of increasing free energy rate density and informational richness over time. Indeed, using free energy rate density calculations alone, Chaisson charts a clear trend toward complexification from matter to plant life to animals to culture. Citing some key figures in a 2014 article, he summarizes, "Among physical systems, stars and galaxies generally have energy rate densities that are among the lowest of organized structures. For plant life on Earth, energy rate densities are well higher than those of normal stars and typical galaxies. Likewise, as animals evolved from fish and amphibians to reptiles, mammals, and birds, their own energy rate density values rose still more. Not surprisingly, brains have among the highest values of energy rate density for all living things. Social evolution can be tracked, again in terms of normalized energy consumption, for a variety of human-related cultural advances among our ancestral forebears, from early agriculturists to modern technologists. The number continues to increase. Such energy density increases correspond to increasing informational richness. Indeed, Chasson writes, "To us, information basically is a form of energy. Thus, as the universe evolves more complex entities, more and more information is being generated, including the semantic information for those entities in context. Because increasing energy density and structural complexity are cause for ever-increasing semantic information processing, Azarian calls cosmic complexification itself a learning process." He says, "By now we can see a simple story emerging. By reducing Shannon entropy or ignorance, life is able to extract the energy it needs to reduce Boltzmann entropy or disorder. The growth of knowledge and the spread of organized complexity therefore go hand in hand. The second law is the impetus for learning." Learning thus appears to be the natural consequence and driver of a complexifying universe, as more energetically dense entities emerge to embody and encode more information about their environments. In this process, the very means by which information gets processed complexifies, with novel computational mechanisms emerging out of earlier ones to process new kinds of information. As physicist and quantum computing theorist Seth Lloyd expresses it, "The history of the universe in terms of information processing revolutions, each arising naturally from the previous one, already hints at why a computing universe necessarily gives rise to complexity. In fact, we can prove mathematically that a universe that computes must, with high probability, give rise to a stream of ever more complex structures." If increasingly complex entities in context are processing more and more semantic information to maintain themselves in the face of entropy, then we must conclude that meaning itself has been complexifying through time. But what does this actually mean? Is meaning really growing more intricate, refined, nuanced, rich, deep, sophisticated? What does high complexity meaning look like compared to less complex meaning? To unpack this idea, we must examine these successive information processing revolutions that Lloyd refers to, which have punctuated the complexification of the universe, such as marks the transition from matter to life. We must follow the arc of cosmic complexification and identify just what entities are processing what sorts of meaningful knowledge in a manner that maximizes their viability, and how this leads to qualitatively deeper forms of meaning. The Unified Theory of Knowledge, or UTOK, is a big history framework that offers perhaps the best map of cosmic complexification to date. It was developed by Greg Henriques, a professor of psychology at James Madison University, with the intent to properly situate psychological phenomenon within the context of natural sciences and evolutionary history. In the process, it has helped clarify not only the field of psychology, but emergent evolutionary history more broadly, presenting a convincing meta-theoretical synthesis of different scientific disciplines that all tell one coherent narrative of cosmic complexification. Two components of the framework specifically, the Tree of Knowledge diagram and the Periodic Table of Behavior chart, bring a special clarity to the way information processing by thermodynamic entities in their respective environments has led to a universe of stratified behavioral patterns constituting genuinely novel planes of existence. As Henriques notes in his 2023 book on the UTOK framework, A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology, quote, "The emergence of information theory, information science, chaos and complexity sciences, and philosophical analyses of living and mental creatures all show why a strong physical reductionism or eliminative materialism is a fallacious frame for scientific knowledge. The TOK and PTB show how the natural world is singular and monistic in the sense that the foundational ground of existence is an energy information field out of which the dimensions of behavioral complexity called matter, life, mind, and culture emerge. These latter three all give rise to complex adaptive dynamic systems whose patterns of behavior are not just matter and energy on a field of space and time, but include dynamically self-organizing complex adaptive systems that engage in information processing and communication behaviors that require different metaphysical concepts above and beyond efficient causation. That is, contrary to older reductionist notions long prevailing in the sciences, phenomenon at the levels of life, mind, and culture are emergent, exhibiting behavior inexplicable by a reductionistic analysis of material parts in isolation. These emergent planes are such because of the novel kinds of information processed at each successive level. As Henriques summarizes it, according to the TOK system, genetic information processing gives rise to the dimension of life, neuronal information processing gives rise to the dimension of mind, and symbolic information processing gives rise to the dimension of culture. More specifically, I will argue we can actually say that these are novel kinds of meaning that have emerged, since these are kinds of information that entities may process in the learning of knowledge that bears on their viability. Genetic meaning speaks a different language than neuronal meaning, which speaks a different language still from symbolic meaning. These novel information processing systems create unique adaptive contexts that must be navigated according to their own informational demands, such that meaningful information has new emergent properties at each new level. The tree of knowledge diagram maps these levels, showing the emergence of life from matter, mind from life, and culture from mind. Given these unique informational contexts, each level thus sees its own kind of system-environment couplings. The UTOK's periodic table of behavior (PTB) chart provides a concise map of these increasingly complex kinds of entity-field relationships that arise within the different complexity planes of matter, life, mind, and culture. As Henriques summarizes it, the PTB affords us a new epistemological lens that creates an ontological taxonomy of entity-field relations across the levels and dimensions of analysis that make up the stratification of behavioral complexification in nature. They develop across material, biological, psychological, and cultural levels of complexity. Thus, we see that the entity-field relationship, unfolding through the four planes of complexification, can be identified as follows. 1. The object-field relationship of the matter plane. 2. The organism-ecology relationship of the life plane. 3. The animal-environment relationship of the mind plane. And 4. The person-society relationship of the culture plane. Each coupling, I posit, creates mutual information correlating system with environment. Because of that, each coupling represents unique demands on viability, and thus a domain where unique qualities of meaning manifest. In fact, each entity up the complexity stack must engage with all of the various behavioral contexts below it. That is, for example, humans must navigate their socio-ecological culture, yes, but also the ecologies of animals, the environments of organisms, the fields of objects, and all of the permutations of their interactions. A human must have meaningful relationships with all of these domains if they are to continue existing effectively in such a world. Such relationships are not meaningful only in the subjective ways, but rather in a manner that is intricately tied up with reality going all the way down to thermodynamic necessity. To misinterpret the meaning of a grizzly bear, animal environment, or E. coli bacteria, organism ecology, or a steep cliff, object field, is to face entropic annihilation. To say it again, meaning of this kind has causal power. To meaningfully know a thing is to integrate its information in an adaptive way. Meaning is what enhances viability at every level by informing the behavioral interventions needed for entities to thrive. Thus, the more complex an entity is, the more complex information it must process across the numerous planes of reality. While all semantic information does ultimately cash out at the thermodynamic level, there are, it must be repeatedly stressed, novel layers to meaning introduced as complexity unfolds. These novel layers emerge as more complex information is processed through the universal learning process, such that meaningful information gets generated differently as you move up the complexity stack, but accumulates in an accretive way. Meaning for cells is processed as genetic information, but meaning for an animal modifies mere genetic selection with an overlay of neuronally meaningful information processing. For humans, viability-enhancing meaning must be sought across both of these informational domains, as well as through symbolic exchanges. Complexification and Learning. If it is true that meaning arises from the mutual information correlating entities and environments, and that these entity-field dynamics complexify through the emergent levels of matter, life, mind, and culture, then entities at all levels can be understood as engaging in an increasingly complex learning process whereby more sophisticated forms of meaning emerge. If for anything to exist means it has navigated its environment successfully enough to have not succumbed to entropy, then there is meaningful information linking that entity to its conditions, and so also what Azarian calls knowledge, even at the most basic level. The learning process of entities in the universe, then, can be understood as extending from the most complex adaptive organisms like human beings on the culture plane, down to animals in their environments on the mind plane, down still further to biological entities like single-celled organisms and plants on the life plane, and, I would argue, even shades down into the plane of matter, where inanimate objects can complexify through pre-Darwinian forms of evolution, for example, autocatalysis, dissipative adaptation, etc., and whose very existence as objects may even arise from quantum decoherence mechanisms based on similar selection pressures, though calling this learning obviously stretches the term to its breaking. To delineate these distinct levels of learning relative to complexity, and thus their relative kinds of meaning, we can speak of 1. Structural learning connected to matter, 2. Genetic learning connected to life, 3. Cognitive learning connected to minds, and 4. Symbolic learning connected to culture. Through these, increasingly complex forms of learning, purpose, and value emerge to grow more rich, comprehensive, and integrated. The majority of this book series will focus on the sort of learning that takes place on the culture plane. But before we arrive there, let's take a journey through the preceding levels that lead up to and give rise to such complex human meaning, a path connecting us to the universal learning process. Structural learning. Matter. We start at the lowest level, begun nearly 14 billion years ago, where learning seems at best a semantically loose description for the sorts of processes underway. That is what we should expect, though, if we mean to trace the continuum from the crudest, most provisional forms of adaptive information processing up to the most complex. At this basal level, we are dealing with the very rudiments of the objective world and how they come into being. Here we ask, could this process also be subject to the sort of viability filtering mechanisms that characterize genuine learning at higher levels of complexity? John Campbell thinks so. In his books Universal Darwinism, The Path of Knowledge, and The Knowing Universe, Campbell draws on the 2009 work of theoretical physicist Wojciech Zurek of the Los Alamos National Laboratory to show how quantum decoherence, the process by which quantum states become determined as classical reality, operates in terms of inferential information processing. Since the early 20th century, quantum mechanics has puzzled physicists by its fundamentally probabilistic nature, which is so unlike the deterministic certainty of classical physics. Do all possible states of quantum phenomena exist then, somewhere, somehow, perhaps in a multiverse of some kind? The seeming gulf between a quantum world of probability and a classical objective world of definite objects has left theoretically unresolved the transition from one realm to the other. Zurek, Campbell, and other proponents of quantum Darwinism resolve this question by seeing the transition to the classical objective world as one of information transfer subject to environmental selection. Quote, only the effects of quantum systems that can pass through the filter of decoherence compose our reality. Campbell writes, quantum systems participate in reality only through those interactions. When analyzed in detail, these interactions or quantum decoherences consist of a transfer of information between the quantum system and the web of objective reality. Not all information concerning the quantum system is transferable. In fact, the vast majority is not transferable. The relatively tiny amount of information that can be transferred is selected from the huge range of quantum possibilities and the numerous copies of this information which are deposited in the environment by a Darwinian process. In this way, when interactions occur, only the environmentally viable information is selected from the vast variability of possible states. The resulting conditions then form the informational basis for determining future selection, and so on. Because of this, the very fabric of reality arises through a sort of quantum computation, which is continually updating the realizable possibilities of future states of the universe. So framed, the objective universe is itself the acquired knowledge, i.e., the adaptive information of a quantum learning process. Such quantum computational models are compelling, but admittedly speculative. Once entities have entered the classical plane of deterministic matter, however, we are on surer ground. It is clear to see how interactions among physical particles unfold within the object-field relationship of the PTB. For a particle's activities become impinged upon by other particles and forces in its environment, which affect its viability as a stable, persisting entity. In the proto-Darwinian struggle for survival, not of the fittest but simply of the stable, particles that formed into enduring atoms outcompeted particles that did not, and so persisted. Among the vast variations, some stability gets selected for by the environment. And though material objects are not in any way animate agents in this process, let alone conscious or volitional ones, the end result is the endurance of structure against entropy through being well fitted to an environmental niche, the basis of the entity-field relationship, and so also of meaningful information. But again, is this really learning? Admittedly, given the very minimal degree of complexity at this level, using a word like learning for such interactions which are so alien to our sense of the term may seem specious. Nevertheless, it is the indisputable continuity with later forms of learning that I believe renders such an interpretation eminently valid. Indeed, one need not rise all the way to the level of life to see this made plain. The dissipative structures described by Nobel-winning chemist Ilya Prigozhin represent a much clearer instance of purely material objects navigating the energy dynamics of their environment to push back against entropy and maintain structural persistence, the essence of learning semantic information as defined above in this book. Such structures include entities like whirlpools, hurricanes, and tornadoes, which more effectively dissipate free energy through the spontaneous emergence of greater order. Indeed, we can recognize that they arise, functionally speaking, to dissipate that energy. If meaningful information is what allows an entity to maintain its informational structure in the face of entropy, then we are forced to conclude that such entities even have meaning. From here, one can track the process into genuine dissipative adaptation, such as Jeremy England and others are exploring, whereby the specific environmental conditions of the energy itself actually select for what structures emerge. Teleological or goal-directed behavior is thus evident even in prebiotic entities. That is, all of this learning unfolds entirely on the plane of matter. And while the details of abiogenesis out of dissipative adaptation remain to be filled in, there are promising signs that the evident continuity between material dissipative structures and biological organisms, which are clearly a subset of the former, will offer new revelations about the origins of life. At the very least, it shows us that an entity need not be a full-blown biological organism to exist in an entity-field relationship whose correlation defines meaningful knowledge to the entity. Rather, a very crude, simplistic form of meaning exists even for a whirlpool, as Kolchinsky and Wolpert's framework posits. While this may seem at first to diminish the very idea of meaning, it actually does the opposite, I believe. For by showing that meaning connects down into the very rudiments of reality, we can see the error, common these days, of presuming it to be merely subjective, or as a thing that only humans make up as some arbitrary social construction. To the contrary, meaning, along with a related word, teleology, are both quite real, something cyberneticists and complexity scientists have long appreciated as they endeavor to explain goal-directed material phenomena like dissipative structures. As Azarian concludes, with dissipative structures, a natural pressure to minimize free energy and produce entropy spontaneously creates an ordered structure with an objective function. With the emergence of dissipative structures, we see the emergence of purpose in nature. Genetic learning. Life. Of course, the universal learning process, and thus meaning, becomes appreciably clearer to recognize when, around 3.8 billion years ago, we see its first truly sublime product, life, a particular kind of dissipative structure that can also reproduce itself via meaningful information. Such is the system environment knowledge contained in the genetic code. Here, meaning truly comes into view as the goal-directed character of biological behavior becomes overt and undeniable. On this point, the work of neuroanthropologist Terence Deacon has been especially elucidating, offering a profound contribution to the reappraisal of meaning and teleology in the biological sciences. Since Darwin, teleology had been summarily eschewed from naturalistic descriptions of life and its development, replaced instead by an emphasis on blind meandering and undirected chance. Having identified the crucial efficient cause of natural selection, that is, the basic material cause-effect mechanism, biologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries believed they could then dispense with the idea of any teleological final cause, such as Aristotle had once identified for organisms, which is to say, the idea that their end, goal, or purpose structurally informs them. Ultimately, however, the failures of a purely reductionistic biology to adequately explain biological organisms without reference to goals and aims has led to a paradigm shift in the field, as emergentist frameworks from complexity science have helped shed important new light on long-vexing problems about biological behavior. Deacon's work is a significant contribution to this paradigm shift. In his comprehensive 2012 book, Incomplete Nature: How Mind Emerged from Matter, he offers a scientifically robust and philosophically compelling reconsideration of teleology's role in biology. By emphasizing the inherent lack or need of goal-directed entities, i.e. their incompleteness, Deacon removes teleology from a speculative metaphysical register and places it comfortably within a processual physical one. This allows us to see the commonalities that exist between all entities intrinsically constituted in processual relation to an absent goal state. As he puts it, such concepts as information, function, purpose, meaning, intention, significance, consciousness, and value are intrinsically defined by their fundamental incompleteness. They exist only in relation to something that they are not. Such absence thus motivates, in the most basic etymological sense we might say, causes to move, animates, the behavior of biological entities. This dynamic is clearest in highly complex organisms like ourselves, who aspire, wish, will, intend, etc. Meaning and purpose are clear, we might say, within the PTB's person-society field of culture. But appreciating the deeper dynamic of motivational absence allows us to trace the quality of such meaning back down through less complex forms, which is precisely what we have been endeavoring to do here. As Deacon proposes, because it is complex, the concept of mental purpose can be progressively decomposed, revealing weaker forms of this consequence-organized relationship that do not assume intrinsic mentality. Thus, the concepts of function, information, and value have counterparts in living processes, which do not entail psychological states, and from which these more developed forms likely derive. To distinguish from the associations of purpose with more complex cognitive versions of intentional behavior, Deacon coins the term intentional, which can apply also to unconscious goal-directedness at the purely biological level. Intentional entities are teleologically driven. As Deacon puts it explicitly, intentional processes and relationships can best be classed as expressions of final causality in Aristotle's terms. In short, living organisms have meanings. But unlike in ancient theological or speculative metaphysics, such meaning is not an essence directly bestowed upon creatures by a transcendent creator, but rather a product of the intrinsic relational dynamics between an organism and its ecological context. That is, we might say, it emerges from the semantic information linking a biological organism with its ecological niche. As Deacon puts it, intentional processes have a distinctive and characteristic dynamical circularity, and their causal power is not located in any ultimate stuff, but in this dynamical organization itself. Our ultimate scientific challenge is to precisely characterize this geometry of dynamical forms, which leads from thermodynamic processes to living and mental processes, and to explain their dependency relationships with respect to one another. It is a quest to naturalize teleology and its kin. In thermodynamic terms, the telos of a biological organism is, like other dissipative structures, to remain far from equilibrium. Behavior directed toward this goal, for example a bacterium navigating toward nutrients through chemotaxis, is purposive behavior, and information that assists in this purposive behavior is meaningful information. What distinguishes the meaningful knowledge unique to life, however, is a novel information processing language, genetics. This, according to the Utah tree of knowledge, is what marks the emergence of a novel type of entity exhibiting a novel form of behavior. Whereas dissipative structures arise spontaneously and then disappear as conditions demand, life is different in that it has been able to persist and reproduce without interruption since its initial emergence some 3.8 billion years ago. By being able to store meaningful information in the genetic code and transmit this information through reproduction, an entirely new level of complexity has taken hold in the universe. Specifically, life stores meaningful information about the environment in DNA. With this, we begin to see an early form of representation in the cosmic learning process. Deacon stresses this aboutness as a crucial characteristic of the mutual information linking organism and ecology, writing, "Living organisms are far from equilibrium systems that are dependent on transforming the physics of their interaction with the environment into information about their environment. This is why organism features reflect the constraints of their environments, and what justifies claiming that the information embodied in a phenotype and its genotype is information about this environment. But this aboutness only reflects these environmental constraints with respect to the constraints of the formative processes critical to reproduction and self-maintenance of that organism. Meaningful information for biological organisms encodes relevant reference to the world that the organism inhabits. Such representations, however, are not stored in the memory of the individual organism. That does not arrive until the level of mind, when nervous systems and brains emerge. Rather, these representations are translated into the language of DNA itself. The very information that shapes the organism includes semantic information about its world. Organisms are embodied meaning. Crucially, though, life does more than store information about its environment, it also updates that information. Through the natural selection of evolution, meaningful information gets filtered according to environmental pressures, creating, over time, an increasingly intimate coupling between organism and ecology. The meaning inherited by an organism in its DNA is matched against its environmental conditions. As this signal gets transferred across generations, it is subject to entropy, just like any kind of Shannon information. This introduces variation in the signal, and these variant meanings can be better or worse adapted to their conditions. Better adapted informational couplings are selected and get carried forward, such that meaning comes to carry more significant information about the environment. In this way, genetic evolution and natural selection add a crucial pruning mechanism to the transmission of meaningful information through time. As Deacon puts it in his essay, Shannon Boltzmann Darwin, Redefining Information, quote, "What counts as useful information in biological evolution is determined after the fact with respect to its ability to pass through the functional error correction mechanism of natural selection. The accuracy of the inheritance signal is both tested and refined by the way the far from equilibrium dynamics that constitutes the organism's development, maintenance, and reproduction conform to the environmental constraints and opportunities. Evolution is thus a generator of information for the organism and a process that rectifies this information with its reference. Thus also the evolutionary process is itself non-normative. It produces organisms capable of making normative assessments of the information that they receive. In sum, evolution through natural selection behaves as a learning process at the level of life. It is the special mechanism at this level that allows meaningful knowledge to be stored and updated, furthering the complexification of energy, information, and structure. Deacon's mention of normativity above highlights a crucial point, however, and one that will become increasingly important as we move forward. That is, nature's learning process we have been describing produces knowledge that is meaningful only to the degree that it assists the entities producing it to better navigate their entity-field relationship. That is to say, information gets its causal power to the degree it is of value to the existence of the entity, i.e., whether it assists the entity in its goal to remain far from equilibrium. Value, then, is also an inherent product of the entity-field relationship. Value does not exist in and of itself, but in the dynamic adaptive contexts relating organism to ecology, animal to environment, etc. That is, in the process of energy informing structures adapted to specific environments. Another way to express this is to say that value, good versus bad, must be understood as deriving from the entity-field relationship, wherein there is a relative good for an entity as well as a relative bad for that entity. For a bacterium on the life plane, navigating via chemotaxis toward a collection of nutrients is good for its continued existence, aiding its efforts to obtain free energy to maintain itself in the face of entropy and so persist. Conversely, navigating into an area flooded by toxins is bad for the bacterium, threatening its basic integrity as an organism. Even though the single-celled organism is among the most primitive of entities on the life plane, we can still identify values for the organism, which have meaning for it as information with real causal power relative to its flourishing or annihilation. In fact, Deacon himself recognizes that this normativity actually goes even further back than life. He points to the example of autocatalysis, a chemical process whereby a collection of molecules reciprocally and recursively create more and more of themselves. This feedback loop is an intentional process in the sense that it is goal-directed and thus purposive in its behavior. More complex than a whirlpool, but still simpler than a full-blown living organism, it likewise has its form of normative value. As Deacon recognizes, functions are normative to the extent that they fail or succeed to achieve some end. So even these simple molecular systems have crossed a threshold in which we can say that a very basic form of value has emerged, because we can describe each of the component autogenic processes as there for the sake of the autogen integrity or for the maintenance of that particular form of autogenicity. Likewise, we can describe different features of the surrounding molecular environment as beneficial or harmful, in the same sense that we would apply these assessments to microorganisms. More important, These are not merely glosses provided by a human observer, but the intrinsic and functionally relevant features of the consequence-organized nature of the autogen itself. Surprising as it sounds, because meaning exists even on the level of matter, there is value even for purely material entities to the extent that they resist entropy and are thus goal-directed. Like meaning itself, this does not diminish the idea, but rather makes it all the more theoretically robust. Meaning and value exist not as mere social constructs or subjective inventions, but as real aspects of the world. They do not, we must stress, inhere in things themselves as essences bestowed, such as traditional theological thinking proposed, but neither are they purely subjective experiences overlaid on the world, such as modern reductionistic thinking has tended to assume. Rather, they arise in the dynamic relationship between an entity and its contextual field. Meaning is real because it is contextual. Meaning, you could say, is a real relationship. In terms of the Utah map of complexification, the life plane is defined by meaning processed as genetic information. Indeed, as many biologists have argued, the actual informational individual here is not so much the single organism as the broader gene pool, the species. Viability is adjusted for the group, not just the entity, so meaning transcends the organism. At the genetic level, meaning is fully collective, since learning is only collective at this stage. With time, though, through the success of viable species, still more complex information processing systems evolved. Specifically, a certain kind of multicellularity led to the emergence of neuronal nets that developed into increasingly complex nervous systems and integration of information that gave rise to an entirely new emergent dimension of complexity: mind. Cognitive learning. Mind. The proliferation of networked systems of nerve cells, i.e. nervous systems, with a central processing center, i.e. brains, that we see marking the Cambrian explosion circa 530 million years ago, occasioned the emergence of a novel dimension of complexity and information processing. At this new level of minded animals, mind, the PTB entity-field relationship is that of the animal-environment coupling. And with such animals, we see the emergence of neurocognitive computation of meaningful information. Meaning becomes sensory, mobile, and eventually subjectively experiential. The evolution of mobile bodies that could freely navigate the environment meant organisms could now learn in the sense more familiar to us, that is, by direct sensory engagement with the environment in real time. Before, at the level of life, learning occurred only at the population, phylogenetic level, as natural selection updated the species' genetic code to better match environmental conditions. Meaning was passed down through genetic inheritance from generation to generation. It was embodied but not experienced, reflexive but not reflective. Memory was something in the genes, not in the head. With the emergence of nervous systems, however, this changed. For one thing, it saw the evolution of heads. Natural selection hit on the bilateral symmetry of the animal body plan, with the nervous system's central processor, its brain, positioned in the anterior. With brains, the updating of meaningful information could now take place at the individual ontogenetic level, as individual organisms could now revise their own internal models of the world based on sense inputs from their surroundings in real time. Such information could then be stored in individual cognitive memory, akin to the way information had been stored as collective genetic memory. This meant that in addition to the relatively slow pace of genetic adaptation, there could now be much quicker behavioral adaptation. All this entailed a massive upgrade for the universal learning process, allowing information of much greater complexity to be processed at much greater speed by evolving animals. It also entailed that animals develop increasingly sophisticated internal models of the world they inhabited. As Richard Dawkins has put it, survival machines that can simulate the future are one jump ahead of survival machines who can only learn on the basis of overt trial and error. The trouble with overt trial is that it takes time and energy. The trouble with overt error is that it is often fatal. simulation is both safer and faster. At the complexity level of mind, animals learn to simulate the world with greater and greater reliability in their bid to reduce ignorance about the environment and remain far from equilibrium. This is the core insight of Carl Friston's theory of cognition, active inference, which is based on the free energy principle of predictive processing. According to this unified brain theory, the mind is a complex adaptive system that allows animals to stay far from equilibrium, specifically by modeling their environment and continually updating that mental model through comparisons with how well actual sensory inputs match its expectations. Based on these calibrations, animals adapt their behavior and get better at predicting the world, aka learning. To achieve this, however, renders meaning into a mental computational challenge. What information about the world exactly should be included in the nervous system's mental model? What can be safely ignored? There is, we have seen, an infinite amount of information in Shannon's sense that might be considered. How does a cognitive entity single out only the relevant subset of that information to optimally navigate the environment? How can neurons detect viability? How can significance be computed? John Vervaeke, a 4E cognitive scientist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, has proposed a theory of relevance realization that addresses this issue and extends the sort of meaning that we have been considering into the register of mind. The 4 E's of 4E cognitive science refer to the embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended nature of mind. That is, cognition is 1. Localized in embodied organisms, 2. Embedded in environmental contexts, 3. Inactive of the world with which it engages, and 4. Able to be extended beyond the internal bounds of the brain through technologies like tools and writing. Such a framework has proven crucial for moving the field of cognitive science beyond simplistic input-output computational models by appreciating the mind's fundamentally incarnated and contextualized emergence from complex adaptive biological systems in rich ecological contexts. All of this is necessary for appreciating how minded animals process information as meaningful. Consonant with our previous considerations of meaning, Vervaeke's theory of relevance realization emphasizes the coupling of system and environment. He refers to the entity-field relationship at this level as the agent-arena relationship, the domain of agential subjects operating in objective contexts. Appreciating the crucial insight that meaning arises in relational exchange between subjects and their environment, Vervaeke coins the term transjective to capture the mutually informing aspect of the subject-object-arena-agent relationship. Meaning, he says, is transjective, arising from the dynamic interplay of subjects within their objective world. This idea of transjectivity is helpful, and I will use it going forward to refer to the specific dynamic inherent to all entity-field relationships, as it captures a key reality of meaning at every level of complexity. For embodied mobile agents navigating environments to achieve their goals, the thermodynamic imperative manifests as solving various situational problems. For example, acquiring food, avoiding predators. To meet these challenges, says Vervaeke, agents must learn to accurately identify the relevant information in their salience landscape. To this end, minded animals have evolved neurocognitive mechanisms that assist in relevance realization, to filter out probably unmeaningful information and home in on probably meaningful information. As Vervaeke puts it, for an agent to take action in even relatively simple circumstances, it must somehow intelligently ignore a great deal of information. This idea has clear connections to Kolchinsky and Wolpert's more basic formulation of meaning considered at the outset. As they articulated it, there is a connection between paying attention to the right information, as measured by semantic efficiency, and being thermodynamically efficient. Meaning is only a subset of all possible information. Vervaeke's relevance realization would model how minded animals learn to pay attention to the right information. Indeed, so fundamental does this idea appear to virtually all aspects of cognition that he declares relevance realization is the criterion of the cognitive. As for how minded animals do this, Vervaeke and colleagues posit a number of distinct trade-off relationships built into the response dynamics of cognitive agents. All of these represent so-called opponent processes of various types, contrasting orientations which ultimately converge toward a dynamic equilibrium with the environment through ongoing recalibration in light of new sensory feedback. That is, by continually negotiating the proper contextually appropriate balance between compression, i.e. generalization on the one hand, versus particularization on the other, assimilation versus accommodation, integration versus differentiation. Animals find the optimal grip required for their context. They write, compression results in the assimilation of information to existing structures and therefore results in the integration of information. Particularization results in the accommodation of existing structures to information so that the differentiation of information occurs. Since the brain is doing both in an opponent fashion, it is simultaneously developing both integration and differentiation. A system that simultaneously integrates and differentiates its functions is complexifying as a system. This is important because complex systems have emergent functions. This is the way in which the brain can develop its competence to deal with a complex world, viz. It self-complexifies or develops. In short, cognitive learning is a complexification process, a finding that shouldn't surprise us in light of our considerations so far. Such cognitive complexification amounts to a dynamic developmental process. As Vervaeke puts it elsewhere, cognition is inherently developmental in nature rather than development just being the peripheral issue of how cognition emerges. Thus, we may speculate that developmental psychology ought to be seen as central to cognitive psychology. Indeed, as we shall see in the following book, a dynamic equilibrium achieved via continual assimilation versus accommodation was precisely the mechanism of human learning articulated by the constructivist developmental psychologists in the early 20th century. We can thus already anticipate how these same cognitive dynamics carry forward into the culture plane, where symbolic learning progresses by means of hierarchical complexification of linguistic semantic meanings, not just sensory motor and perceptual schemas. More immediately, though, we must finish our analysis of how cognitive meaning unfolds as the animal mind complexifies. Here we encounter some profound emergent properties of utmost importance. For while we have been considering cognition and intelligence as they relate to mind, one crucial concept has so far remained conspicuously absent from our discussion, one which was absolutely essential to all notions of meaning and value, such as we humans are familiar with. Consciousness. With consciousness, meaning becomes experiential for the first time. Meaning becomes subjective. It becomes, that is, what we as humans intuitively think of when we describe anything as meaningful or significant in some way. It becomes felt as meaningful. But how did consciousness emerge out of unconscious cognitive information processing? In their 2019 book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, Learning and the Origins of Consciousness, Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka trace this evolution in some detail. Consciousness, they posit, is a direct product of the neuronal infrastructure laid down by animals as they developed more comprehensive integrated world modeling capacities. Cognitive learning, they say, was what led to subjectivity. They write, when we usually think about consciousness and sentience, we do not usually think about learning. What comes to mind are the immediate experiences of seeing a sunflower, feeling a stab of pain or a flood of joy, of hearing the song of a blackbird, of smelling freshly baked bread, tasting a ripe banana. These experiences can be fleeting and we may soon forget them, but how did animals come, evolutionarily and developmentally, to have such experiences? Learning was the basis on which this experiencing process was constructed. There is no point in sensory discrimination in a rapidly yet recurrently changing world if we are unable to remember it and use it to improve our lot. Moreover, we suggest that even fleeting experiences involve processes of stabilization and updating that are intimately related to learning, as is most obvious during early development. All pattern perception and compound action selection depend on learning, because all rely on the learned construction of updatable models of the world in which the animal acts. Specifically, Ginsberg and Jablonka see subjective consciousness emerging in animals as they transition from simpler learning methods like reflex-based behavioral conditioning or associative learning to the full repertoire of what they call unlimited associative learning, which saw broad hierarchical integration of such responses along with a developed memory system. One way to summarize this development in a way that brings to the fore our present concern is to say that multiple domains of cognitive meaning became integrated in animals, such that distinct purpose and value systems synced up in a holistic manner so as to better guide the organism's efforts to stay far from equilibrium. Ginsberg and Jablonka speak of a single integrated value currency emerging from this integration. Simplistically put, you might imagine how each sense organ has its own way to tag information as potentially helpful or potentially harmful for viability. Feces or food trigger repulsion or attraction for the nose. A sharp rock or a lover's smooth body trigger repulsion or attraction for the skin. Sight of a predator or mate trigger repulsion or attraction for the eyes, etc. Integrating all these unique interpretive senses into a holistic unit, the self, with a single value currency, pain or pleasure, is necessary for the sort of conscious experience we are familiar with. When this happened as part of the evolutionary process, diverse meanings became unified into a single teleological normative experience, and consciousness was born. Ginsberg and Jablonka write, "There are constant changes in the world of a mobile animal, and it needs to detect them with its sense organs and respond to them through the flexible coordination of its muscle sheets. The value reinforcement system has to accommodate these world and action changes and deal with their potentially conflicting effects. Should the animal first satisfy its need for food and approach object X, or retreat because it smells the scent of a predator in the area? The animal must therefore have a common value currency for consistently evaluating types of world and body state over another type according to its value, which is context dependent. As several scholars have suggested, pleasures and displeasures can be seen as such overall and general currencies of value, which can evaluate any percept or action. Consciousness, then, is the result of hierarchically integrating animal meanings in an enduring, temporally extended way. Experience is inherently evaluative and inherently driven to detect meaning. Ginsberg and Jablonka compile a list of neurobiologists' criteria for consciousness that they say their account successfully meets. The list includes 7 criteria which I believe can themselves be distilled down into just 3 categories, which I would call intentionality, integration, and identity. Consciousness is the hierarchical integration of intentional learning processes into a single subjective identity experience with intentionality. Consciousness then represents the holistic integration of intentional, meaning-driven cognitive mechanisms into a temporally extended manner such that a distinct self emerges for whom such value states are experienced as subjective qualia like pleasure and pain. In this way, the meaningful information processed by cognitive entities as good for and bad for form the basis of nature's first subjective experiences, whose valences reflect the binary response patterns of what I prefer to call attraction and repulsion. Subjective valence states arise when this value-laden knowledge is networked in reference to the animal as a whole, to be broadcast coherently throughout the body in order to perform the requisite response as a unit that orients itself toward its goal states. Through this integration of information, the organism acquires new functionality of the experience of pleasure, good for, and pain, bad for. Can the level of this integration be measured? The Integrated Information Theory, IIT, of consciousness, developed by Giulio Tononi and colleagues, posits a specific metric, phi, for assessing how complexly wired or integrated the neurons of a nervous system are with one another, and directly identifies this measure with the level of sentient awareness of an animal. More conservatively, we can say that such integration levels likely correlate directly to degrees of consciousness, in which case the phi level, if it could be directly measured, could help us quantify conscious depth. IIT posits a connection between an animal's neuronal complexity, phi, and its general intelligence and problem-solving capacity, demonstrating the deep links between learning and consciousness. Indeed, the increase in phi across the evolutionary tree is helpful for mapping the complexification of animals on the plane of mind, and can aid our survey of the complexification of meaning within the domain of cognitive learning. Christoph Koch provides visualization of this neuronal complexification across multiple species in his book, The Feeling of Life. The varying levels of neuronal integration in animals will thus translate into different sorts of subjective experience, and with it different qualia that frame meaning in different ways relative to adaptive context. For instance, a mouse will have a unique subjective experience that emerged through the integration of its species-specific sense for value states and goals relative to its environmental niche, typical food sources, etc. Simply and clichésly put, cheese is meaningful for a mouse. A more complex dog will have its own, though evolutionarily related, values. A frisbee will be subjectively meaningful to it, but not to the mouse. In short, different brains and nervous systems in different transjective contexts will be structured differently according to niche and need, though the underlying mechanics of meaning and relevance realization remain the same. All animals have their transjective values and their relative senses of meaning, which will be experienced differently at the subjective level and feel differently relative to neuronal complexity. The issue of qualitatively distinct and potentially incommunicably different forms of consciousness for different beings was famously raised by philosopher Thomas Nagel in his oft-cited 1974 essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? In it, Nagel reflects on the ways that different animals' specific sense organs and ecological aims so color their subjective experience that it is difficult to see how one context-informed consciousness could even imagine the conditions of differently informed consciousnesses. Our own experience, he writes, provides the basic material for our imagination, whose range is therefore limited. It will not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn catching insects in one's mouth, that one has very poor vision and perceives the surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, and that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in an attic. Insofar as I can imagine this, which is not very far, it tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat behaves. But that is not the question. I want to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Yet if I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. Nagel is often cited as a seminal voice on this topic, but in fact such insights had already been anticipated a generation earlier by Jakob Johann von Uexküll, a German biologist immensely influential on the field of phenomenology, semiotics, and cybernetics. Von Uexküll developed the idea that animals participate in a species' particular Umwelt, or encompassing world, based on the specific kinds of sense organs they possess and the capacities for action and cognition that these afford. To use Nagel's example, the bat perceives the world primarily through sound, not sight, by means of which it is able to locate its food. For bat consciousness, then, information is processed in a manner quite alien to us, with feelings and normative goals quite foreign to those of humans. Based on its neuronal makeup, which evolved according to meet the needs of its environmental niche, bats have learned their own forms of meaning. Indeed, as von Uexküll insightfully argued, the Umwelt of an animal is defined by what matters to it. An animal interprets its meaning based on what it can perceive and do, and what it can perceive and do delimits its range of meaning. Quote, each environment or Umwelt forms a self-enclosed unit which is governed in all of its parts by its meaning for the subject. According to its meaning for the animal, the life stage includes greater or smaller space, in which the places are completely dependent in number and size upon the capacity of the sense organs of respective subjects to draw distinctions. Anything and everything that comes under the spell of the environment, the Umwelt, is either redirected and reformed until it becomes a useful carrier of meaning or is completely neglected. Such is von Uexküll's theory of meaning, which arises out of his biologically informed phenomenological considerations of different animal consciousnesses. From all of this, we conclude that meaning and value are circumscribed by the consciousness of the animal as it has been shaped through adaptation to its environmental conditions. Meanings and values emerge through the transjective system-environment relationship, with an objective aspect that goes all the way down to thermodynamic necessity, and a subjective aspect colored by the values constitutive of the exchange. In some senses, von Uexküll was himself anticipated in this recognition by an even earlier thinker, anthropologist, and philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach intimated the importance of such dynamics when, as early as 1841, he wrote, If the plants had eyes, taste, and judgment, each plant would declare its own flower the most beautiful. For its comprehension, its taste would reach no farther than its natural power of production. What the productive power of its nature has brought forth as the highest, that must also its taste, its judgment, recognize and affirm as the highest. Feuerbach makes this case as much for the caterpillar as the human being. The limits of the nature and consciousness of a being define the potential limits of the value and meaning it can recognize. When we combine these older insights with those of contemporary neuroscience, we can actually begin to link these qualitative distinctions with quantifiable data. Having seen that the level of neuronal complexity plays a crucial role in the origin and evolution of consciousness, we can relate the growth in brain size and integration to the complexification of meaning over time. More integrated nervous systems lead to more complex minds, whose umwelts will be more expansive in sensory input and active capacity. The evolution of meaning parallels the evolution of consciousness. One clear example of this appears in the emergence of social values among animals. With the deepening of subjective, felt experience, reproduction and the rearing of offspring become richly emotional activities. More neuronally complex, intelligent mammals form social bonds and relationships with other members of their group that are mediated by value-laden informational exchanges. That is, relationships with other animals have considerable meaning to them, and this is mediated via strong qualia states. One obvious instance of this is to be found in the mother-child bond of advanced primates. But dolphins, elephants, and whales have also been documented exhibiting strong emotional bonding relationships. Such emotional investment into social dynamics also plays out in dominance hierarchies, as males strive to assume positions in the social hierarchy that will render their genetic continuance more viable, for example, becoming the alpha in a group of gorillas. The extension of value and meaning into the social domain opens up new levels of complexity that animals must navigate. As we have seen, complexity begets more complexity, as more complex environmental conditions require more complex adaptive solutions. So as complexifying nervous systems meant bigger brains that could navigate social environments, these new environmental conditions fueled a drive toward even more neuronal complexity. In such cases, evolution selected for bigger brains with an even more integrated neuronal activity and conscious depth. This encephalization process of generating bigger and bigger brains, then, can be read as an empirical indicator of meaning's complexification, the spatio-structural flip side of rising phi and thus deepening subjective consciousness, with increasing intelligence orienting its growing learning capacities toward a more expansive field of value. We see it characterizing the evolution of social primates up to advanced hominids, when the process suddenly explodes exponentially around Homo habilis. Why this sudden takeoff? Had some new variable emerged from this trend, catalyzing it further? Some novel phase transition to a still higher plane of complexity? Could this inflection point signal the dawn of language? In function, symbolic language appears as a natural extension of earlier cognitive learning processes attentive to meaning. Henriques notes, "The human mind is a neurocognitive behavioral investment system that symbolically tags objects and changes in the form of nouns and verbs. The neurocognitive architecture of the pre-verbal human mind is structured to A. attend to relevant objects in the environment, B. identify changes that are happening in predictable and unpredictable ways, C. determine what are desirable and undesirable outcomes, and D. direct subsequent work, i.e. behavioral investment, in an attempt to realize desirable outcomes and avoid undesired ones based on probabilistic expectations." In short, evolution built our primate phenomenology to see the world in behavioral terms. In addition, nature added a language acquisition device that allowed us humans to generate a symbolic syntactical experience of our phenomenological experience. In this way, language emerges directly out of our pre-existing cognitive learning capacities to mentally represent the world, which, as we have seen, emerged out of our genetic learning capacities to biologically encode knowledge of the world into our genome, which emerged out of structural learning capacities to maintain informational identity by adapting to the energetic pressures of the environment. Symbolic communication simply continues the universal learning process into a new register through the introduction of a novel information processing system, language. As Deacon notes in his 1997 book The Symbolic Species, The Co-Evolution of Language and the Brain, the emergence of an early proto-language seems to have thrown fuel on the fire of the encephalization process, further complexifying the mind. He writes, "The remarkable expansion of the brain that took place in human evolution and indirectly produced prefrontal expansion was not the cause of symbolic language, but a consequence of it. As experiments with chimpanzees demonstrate, under optimal training conditions they are capable of learning to use a simple symbol system. So it is not inconceivable that the first step across the symbolic threshold was made by an Australopithecine with roughly the cognitive capacities of a modern chimpanzee, and that this initiated a complicated history of back-and-forth escalations in which symbol use selected for greater prefrontalization, more efficient articulatory and auditory capacities, and probably a suite of other ancillary capacities and predispositions which eased the acquisition and use of this new tool of communication and thought. Each assimilated change enabled even more complex symbol systems to be acquired and used, and in turn selected for greater prefrontalization, and so on. We need not get mired down here in considerations of just how and why language evolved, a question that is still much debated and beyond the scope of this book series. I would simply reiterate the point, non-controversial among scholars, that it appears to have been directly linked to increasing neuronal complexification, i.e., bigger, more densely networked brains, such that symbolic learning can be seen as a byproduct of cognitive learning. It is also worth noting that some theorists, such as evolutionary biologist Kevin Lalland, see language's origin specifically in social learning dynamics. Such a theory fits nicely with the picture I have been painting of a continuous universal learning process leading to the generation of successive novel information processing systems out of earlier ones. Whatever its origin, though, it is clear that once begun, symbolic language precipitated an autocatalytic process leading to a profound qualitative shift in the lived reality of Homo sapiens. For out of this transformation came the truly essential aspects of the human experience, namely the self-conscious individual ego that constitutes the human person, as well as the conceptually mediated technologies, institutions, and collective visions that constitute collective human culture. With these, a whole new kind of meaning emerged in the world, the kind that will preoccupy us for the remainder of this book series. Symbolic learning, culture. Finally, we come to the sort of semantic information processing unique to human beings, symbolic learning. Such learning is distinct from all other kinds in that it participates in intersubjective sociolinguistic contexts. The day a child is born, it becomes immersed in a linguistic world, a cultural Umwelt of shared words, concepts, ideas. Indeed, long before it can actively participate in this discursive world itself, a child is spoken to, sung to, made a passive recipient of conversations, symbols, social customs, and so forth. By means of these, a person will gradually learn to navigate their world through reference to shared abstract symbols. Such symbolic information is hardly the invention of just the rearing parents, of course. It predates and transcends them. Child rearers are largely passing on what they themselves learned in their own rearing and cultural immersion. Education, from the beginning, aims to initiate human beings into a transpersonal sociolinguistic world. This is called enculturation or socialization, the process by which human offspring are slowly molded into active participants within their linguistically mediated culture. The period of educational dependency lasts far longer for human children than for other animals, in large part because of the specific demands of such a learning process. During this time, children have to learn not only the kinds of sensory motor skills that other animals develop to physically navigate the world, as well as the group dynamics of complex social mammals, also the intricacies of the purely symbolic world of their culture's meaningful concepts, ideas, stories, and norms. The symbolic language that enables such mental activity moves beyond mere ostensive reference, for example, communicative signals tagged to specific phenomenal signs, such as animals might use, to an entirely new register of cognitive organization. This is marked by the appearance of grammar and true propositional claims. Not just gazelle there, but a gazelle is there. This important transition, argues Henriques, marks the advent of culture proper as it initiates the uniquely human dynamics of justification. According to justification systems theory, the UTOC meta-theoretical framework for understanding the basis of the culture plane of complexity, human language's development of propositional claims opened up a new discursive space of claim and question, argument and counter-argument. With the linguistic declaration, "a gazelle is there," comes potential rejoinders. Is it? Are you sure? How do you know? For example. This development from animal communication to propositional justificatory language set off a cascade of adaptive pressures and opportunities that would radically transform the Umwelt of Homo sapiens, marking the transition from minded animals to genuinely enculturated persons. Justification systems theory is an ambitious meta-theory that would account for those aspects that make human beings unique from other animals by revealing how the emergence of language utterly reshaped human consciousness and meaning-making. Its three core claims Henriques summarizes this way. 1. The evolution of propositional language generated question-answer dynamics framed as the adaptive problem of justification, and this in turn shaped both the evolution of human self-consciousness and human culture, such that 2. The nature of human consciousness can be framed by the updated tripartite model that differentiates itself into three different domains: A, the experiential self, B, the private ego, and C, the public persona. And 3. Humans are transformed into persons as a function of being socialized into systems of justification, such that, relative to other animals, human persons operate in a new complex adaptive plane that can be effectively framed as culture with a capital C. Understanding these developments is key if we are to appreciate how the meaningful information processed through symbolic learning emerges out of and builds upon that of cognitive learning. So let's unpack them, paying special attention, as we do, to the meaning dynamics as they unfold. 1. Animals, we have seen, are goal-directed, aim-driven entities. Their complex nervous systems allow them to develop and store mental models of reality, physically navigate through those simulated environments, and provide the conscious animal as a whole with ongoing emotional feedback on their actions to help direct its ongoing decision-making and energetic investment. For social animals whose survival depends on successfully operating in collective groups, these cognitive learning processes are naturally extended to include mappings of social dynamics as well. Meaning becomes more indirect as survival is here contingent on attending not just to one's immediate needs and goals, but to the collective's needs and goals as an extension and support of one's own flourishing. Meaningful information now includes how to optimally navigate the behavior of other animals with their goals and intentions. Without language, though, even social animals remain completely isolated within their own individual meaning-making frame. The subjective, conscious experience of an animal's normatively directed emotional life. The intentions of the others remain opaque, gleaned only through outwardly manifested behaviors, for example, a powerful blow or a mating dance. Though mapping a social world, meaning is processed only by and for individuals through the neuronal information processing system of those individual animals. But symbolic language changes this entirely. How? By tearing down the wall isolating meaning within the mind of the individual and opening up the world of meaning to intersubjective exchange. Not just the outward behavior, but the originary, motivating, subjective meaning content of an individual mind can now become a shared object of concern. Subjective understanding and intention become interpersonal understanding and intention, as the inner world of conscious reasons breaks its confines with a single word: why. With such an advance, a cosmos of brute declarative fact learned to be interrogative, and meaning slipped the prison of the solipsistic self. Henriques writes, Unlike chimps, language allows humans to ask and be asked about their thought processes associated with their behaviors. Questions such as, why did you do that? What gives you the right to behave that way? Why should I trust you? Force the issue. Obtaining information about what others think and what they have done, what they plan to do, is obviously important for navigating the social environment in modern times. Given that human beings have always been an intensely social species, there is every reason to believe it was equally essential in the ancestral past. So once people developed the capacity to use language to access the thought patterns of others, they likely did so with vigor. The question-answer dynamic this birthed is entirely novel to the culture plane of complexity, rendered possible by the unique nature of symbolic information processing, which is able to move between thinking agents in a way completely impossible for mere neuronal processing. Whereas genetic learning occurs at the phylogenetic level of the collective species, cognitive learning at the ontogenetic level of the individual organism, symbolic learning allows ontogenetic knowledge to move between individual and collective levels. As Henriques puts it, language-based thoughts, however, are different. This is because propositions move through the nervous system and the boundary of the skin and out into the world and back again without losing their informational form. Our capacity to share in language means that a direct highway of mental information is opened between us. Although I cannot directly share with you my subjective conscious experience of redness, I can directly share my self-conscious language-based description of redness and any other language-based thoughts I might have. Simply put, symbolic language renders intersubjective communication possible. It allows me to translate the cognitive information processing I experience internally into externally transmittable data that others can incorporate into their own learning. Justification is meaning sharing. It is made possible by the ability to transfer meanings processed through cognitive learning into an externalizable symbolic language that encodes our reasons and intentions in a manner others can decipher and engage. In the process, a novel information processing system emerges, and meaning becomes collectively linguistic. 2. Such meaning sharing, though, places a new burden on the individual, for it demands that they first be sufficiently self-conscious of their own internal cognitive processing and personal meanings if they are to properly translate them into language for others. That is, I must develop a self-reflective stance toward my own internal cognitive experience and decision-making, a higher-order perspective on my own intentions, wants, and desires, if I am to model them to others using language. With this demand, a new kind of individual had to develop, the self-conscious person. If consciousness emerged when animal value systems became integrated under a higher-order organization of a singular I that could be recursively related to itself through self-modeling, then self-consciousness emerges when that conscious totality loops back yet again onto itself to model itself through language. So out of the unreflective, experiential self is born the ego. Henriques' model of the human psyche emerges from this crucial insight. Each person has a prelinguistic subjective experience like other animals who operate on the plane of mind. But language affords us the means of rendering this experience communicable, both to ourselves and to others, in pursuance of our normative goals. Doing so leads to the production of a personal ego, which is the private internal voice continually narrating and justifying our experience to ourselves in linguistic terms. Such egos are inherently linguistic in nature, an internal narrative of self-justification continually translating raw emotional experience into the language of symbolic speech. I do not just feel hungry and eat. I think, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat something. More than that, I engage in an ongoing internal monologue of justifications in such terms: should I eat that last slice of pizza in the fridge? I think my brother was saving it, so I probably shouldn't. Then again, maybe it's not that important to him, plus he wouldn't know it was me. No, I'll leave it for him. He seemed interested in it. Besides, he'd definitely assume I did it, get mad at me, and then it would be a whole thing. I'll just make a sandwich. In pursuing my own goals, it is as though I have an internalized other person continually demanding justification for my actions, an enculturated voice in my head asking how my reasons and meanings mesh with the others. The stories I tell myself about myself to organize and justify my behavior, that's my ego. For many reasons, however, individuals do not communicate to others the full contents of their egoic thoughts. Individuals' goals, including maximizing social influence and prestige, are often better pursued by selectively filtering publicly communicated thoughts from privately held ones. The strategic version one presents of themselves to the world, then, is their persona. The resulting three-part conception of the human individual is less composed of A, an experiential self, the conscious animal mind, B, an ego, a linguistically mediated narrative reflection on the experiential self, and C, a persona, the self-concept one projects to others in an effort to maximize success in their social contexts. Henriques calls this an update of the older tripartite self, meaning Freud's id, ego, and superego concept, and one that does justice to insights from both folk and academic psychology by placing all within a meta-theoretical framework rooted in the planes of complexity that have emerged over cosmic evolution. 3. The emergence of language as a means of justification, then, profoundly altered the Umwelt of Homo sapiens as the new dynamics transformed the entity-field relationship from animal environment to person-society by linking self-conscious, self-justifying egos to other self-conscious, self-justifying egos through meaning sharing. Just as animal mind represented a networking of meaning-driven cellular life to produce an emergent plane of complexity, so human culture represents a networking of meaning-driven minds to produce an emergent plane of complexity. Culture, then, is the product of many conscious animals using symbolic communication to integrate subjective information into an intersubjective world model with collective normative goal states. Indeed, this networking of shared meanings is why we must speak of justification systems. As an inherently cultural interpersonal phenomenon, justification never occurs in isolation. Just as there are no private languages, as Wittgenstein observed, there are no private justifications. Linguistic meaning sharing inherently cuts across levels and scales, with person-to-person transjective relationships embedded in micro, meso, and macro-level justification contexts. Drawing on Uri Bronfenbrenner's human ecology theory, Henriques frames this as a nesting of more immediate local contexts within broader, more encompassing ones, with everyone bearing on the other. When we consider the sort of mind networking that is implicit in the socialization of human egos within linguistically mediated culture, then we are necessarily considering a collective, transpersonal context for human meaning formation that transcends individuals. It is the individual sustaining group that is very much the meaning-defining entity now, similar to the way that the animal becomes the meaning-defining entity when cells network together into a multicellular organism. The cell-level meaning does not vanish, but it does shift to accommodate a broader context and serve the normative needs of a broader whole. With the emergence of culture, meaning becomes networked into a macro-level justification system that serves to orient the goals of this collective and keep it far from equilibrium. Meaning at this highest level macro scale is called a worldview. Worldviews are collective justification systems that serve to direct the normative goals of a society as a whole. From this vantage, Azarian writes, "An individual's value is not about physical ability or intelligence. It is about how one contributes to preserving the stability of the social organism we call society. By being unique or having a unique perspective that you share with others through conversation, writing, or art, you are contributing to the diversity of ideas that collectively create the world model of the superorganism. For social organisms, we call that world model a cultural worldview, which can be a religion, national identity, political ideology, or cosmic philosophy. We can make use of a metaphor by saying that the worldview is the Markov blanket for the social organism, because it is what binds the independent agents together to form a collective whole with internal states that are distinct from the external states of the environment, even though there is no tangible physical barrier like a cell membrane or an integumentary system. So just as the individual cells of the nervous system all contribute to the configuration of a world model that aids the viability of an animal in context, so individual human minds in a collective justification system all contribute normative inputs to the world model of the group. What is the biological function of a cultural worldview, asks Cesarian. The worldview, like the world models that came before it, is a strategy for survival, but at this scale it is a strategy for collective survival, for the continued persistence of the superorganism. With this framework in place, we can begin to appreciate the dynamics of symbolic learning as specific manifestations of the universal learning process. For, as Cesarian suggests, the value of individuals is their ability to contribute diverse and novel inputs to the collective world model. When they do, they update the model the same way the nervous system updates its model in the face of novelty and surprise. Collectives can learn, adjusting linguistic conceptual systems of understanding and justification by integrating new information. This is how worldviews evolve, transforming normative frameworks of meaning to adapt to new circumstances and information. And since the overall direction of evolution is toward more optimal flows of energy and informational complexity, worldviews of culture tend to complexify just as life and mind complexify. That is the macro-scale picture of symbolic learning, the complexification of cultural meanings, which impinge upon and influence justificatory contexts below it, all the way down to the microscale of the individual, whose ego takes shape through enculturation into the shared worldview of the group. At this level, symbolic learning is an ontogenetic process unfolding through individual adaptive interactions with the environment. Here, despite language's inherently collectivizing nature, meaning is still individual, concerned with the viability of the person in context. As the unit of culture, the ego learns to meaningfully navigate its world to achieve its normative goals as a multi-layered entity very, very far from equilibrium. The focus of the remainder of this book series will be the transformation of human meaning systems through symbolic learning. Given the inherently transpersonal nature of the linguistic medium through which it operates, this will require looking at both micro and macro scales. That is, the ontogenetic learning done by individuals and the phylogenetic learning done by the species through cultural evolution. Through ontogenetic learning, individuals generate their own slightly different world models. Through justification dynamics, individual decision-making and reasoning based on these world models becomes subject to public scrutiny and winnowed through the selection mechanisms of symbolic learning. In this way, human collectives learn to think together, cohering collective justification systems through the integration of mental information processed by its members. Individuals feed symbolic information to the collective, and the collective rears individuals by means of established symbolic information. That's what enculturation is. Through this process, mediated through individual learning, worldviews develop and human meaning evolves. These dynamics will be explored in much greater detail when we consider the individual-collective feedback cycle in Volume 3. For now, we conclude by noting that knowledge creation in the cultural world is an extension of the integrative evolutionary synthesis that describes cumulative learning at pre-cultural levels of reality. When we follow that trajectory into the plane of culture, we see that human intellectual history is the linguistic version of a knowledge generation mechanism that is driving the entire complexification of the cosmos. Meaning across scales. So what can we say about meaning's complexification then? Throughout this book, I have endeavored to show how meaning has indeed grown richer and more informationally rich across cosmic evolution. Though meaning ultimately stems from the existential requirement to resist entropic disillusion, emergent meanings of complex entities clearly cannot be simplistically reduced to this foundation, but recognized as qualitatively transforming as complexity increases. As meaning has complexified from matter to life to mind, new layers added upon existing ones, building upon previous developments. New kinds of entity-field relationships formed with new kinds of information to process and to interpret for meaning. In this way, genetic meanings gave rise to neuronal meanings, which, for one group of primates with exceptional neuronal complexity, eventually gave rise to language and the domain of symbolic meaning, the stuff of culture. Along the way, meaningful concerns and behaviors proliferated, beginning as a purely thermodynamic imperative to materially persist. Meaning deepened into complex organisms to goal-directed behavior of energy capture, self-maintenance, and reproduction. Then infinitely diversified through an explosion of mobile animals normatively navigating a vast possibility space by means of increasingly complex mental models. All this eventually gave rise to, and plays out within, an inner world of subjective experience, wherein normative values became felt as qualia states for a persisting experiential self, which in time led to social selves in group dynamics sensitive to complex social relationships of all sorts. Language both reframed meanings from previous levels and opened up entirely new domains of meaningful experience. For instance, it aided humans' continued material existence by enriching our mental models with abstract concepts whose patterns dramatically increase our competencies for action and thus our viability. It enhanced and deepened social relationships through intersubjective communication, collective problem-solving, and shared group goals, all of which reshaped sexual relationships and power hierarchies. In these and a million other ways, language transfigured meanings from earlier levels of matter, life, and mind. But it also opens up entirely new realms of meaning unique to the level of culture, as language gives rise to the concept of an egoic self, a theory of mind, and entirely abstract concepts, such that meaning can now unfold through self-awareness, relationship to other selves, and the vast horizon of human reflection, from philosophy to logic to religion to science and beyond. With language, the full range of human meaning becomes possible. Jumping back to our primary sense of meaning discussed at the outset, that of semantic information as what aids an entity in resisting entropy, we see that a through line does indeed run from it all the way to the rich and diverse activities of cultural life that we ourselves actually tend to identify as meaningful and valuable in the common colloquial sense. However, to be clear once more in case there is any lingering confusion, this is not at all to suggest that human meaning can simply be reduced to a survival imperative, any more than human anatomy can be reduced to the skeleton, or the contents of a book reduced simply to the paper upon which it is written. Rather, this through line simply shows how, without the skeleton, the body cannot stand, and without the paper, the book cannot be read. From a secure naturalistic foundation of meaning in thermodynamic principles, we have thus been able to build up a successively more complex set of layers spanning multiple novel information processing systems, which are dependent upon, but not reducible to, the substrates from which they arise. By the time we reach the cultural level of human meaning, there is a rich tapestry of various semantic registers, interweaving symbolic, social, experiential, genetic, and other sources of meaningful information. Underpinning them all, however, is the same basic teleological and thus normative endeavor of the successfully persisting and enhancing viability of organisms. As physicist Carlo Rovelli put it in his 2018 paper, this most basic notion of meaning is the first link in a long chain of successively more complex meanings. The claim here, he says, is not that the full content of what we call intentionality, meaning, purpose, say in human psychology or linguistics, is nothing else than the meaningful information defined herein as thermodynamic viability, but it is that these notions can be built upon the notion of meaningful information, step by step, adding the articulation proper to our neural, mental, linguistic, social, etc. complexity. In other words, I'm not claiming to provide here the full chain from physics to mental, but rather the crucial first link of that chain. Rovelli distinguishes between direct and indirect meaning to reflect the difference of semantic information that has immediate causal bearing on viability in a thermodynamic sense, and that which only secondarily relates to it, for example by being relevant for obtaining more existentially relevant information. Obviously, he writes, not any manifestation of meaning, purpose, intentionality, or value is directly meaningful. Reading today's newspaper is not likely to directly enhance mine or my genes' survival probability. This is the sense of the distinction between direct meaningful information and meaningful information more generally. The second includes all relative information, which in turn increases the probability of acquiring meaningful information. This opens the door to recursive growth of meaningful information and arbitrary increase of semantic complexity. It is this secondary recursive growth that grounds the use of meaningful information in the brain. Starting with meaningful information in the sense defined here, as what aids an entity in resisting entropy, we get something that looks more and more like the full notions of meaning that we use in various contexts, by adding articulations and moving up to contexts where there is a brain, language, society, norms. Over the course of this book, I have endeavored to do just that, to move up the various levels coupling entities to environmental contexts in more complex relationships, whereby more complex meaning is generated. By the time we reach the domain of culture and human symbolic meaning, we are in an intricate field indeed, where all sorts of information vie for attention and interpretation, both directly and indirectly. What all of this ultimately offers us is a robust theorization of human meaning and value, and a framework for understanding how and why these emerge and change. It allows us to see how, one, meaning in human culture constitutes a dynamic system of semantic information processing at multiple levels linking the human person to material, biological, neuronal, and cultural realities. 2, these meanings play out in context in response to specific conditions that characterize the entity-field relationship. And 3, these meanings are subject to the continual revision of an ongoing learning process whereby new information reduces uncertainty and reshapes beliefs and values. Such meanings, we see, constitute an unbroken chain that leads from the most rudimentary to the most lofty. At every level, meaning depends upon the various lower-order meanings that support it. Fostering social relationships, for instance, is rooted in the valence qualia of consciousness, which emerges from world modeling, which depends upon being alive, etc. The meanings unique to human culture are given here, however, admittedly little more than as placeholders for the discussion that will follow. It will be the aim of the remainder of this book to spell out more fully just what the evolution of human meaning and value actually looks like as culture complexifies. To get a better appreciation for how meaning can complexify in this way, let us look at a couple of examples. For this, we can use two profoundly meaningful issues operant at all scales of complexity, namely generation and annihilation. Such matters are obviously fundamental to the issue of viability. What I wish to show here is just how these meanings evolve through complexifying umwelts. Generation at the level of matter is basic and blunt. Nuclear force attraction draws protons and neutrons together. Gravity clumps hydrogen atoms, atoms amass as molecules, etc. Generation is brute and binary. It is or it is not. It happens or does not, the product of chance and determinism. Energy gradients push matter to self-organize as conditions allow, but structures dissolve as conditions change. At the level of life, generation becomes reproduction. Cells divide and duplicate, a marvel of organization that lets life's information live on. Indeed, that is the functional purpose of biological generation. Then, sometime around 2 billion years ago, sexual reproduction evolved, wherein two different living organisms come together to combine their DNA to create a third. On the complexity plane of life, sex is purely mechanical. The knowledge to sexually reproduce exists only within the genetic code of the differently sexed organisms. In flowering plants, for instance, the stamen is the male part that produces seed, and the pistil the female part with the ovary. Seed makes its way to the ovary by wind, pollinators, or other means. Sex is an unconscious and unexperienced act, as there is no nervous system to mediate consciousness or experience. This all changes at the level of mind, where sex becomes a behavior of animals. At this level, the meaning of sex becomes infinitely richer, as it is now overlaid with intense sensory valence qualia thanks to complex nervous systems. Generation becomes mating, operating in a whole new domain of behavioral rituals, performance, competition, etc. Sex becomes carnal and embodied, mediated through pheromones and desires. At less complex levels, the brute mechanical nature remains dominant. Some insects devour their mates, while some animals accidentally kill theirs in the forceful act of reproduction or the competition for it. The drive to reproduce is intense, compulsory, heedless. In more complex animals like mammals, mating is woven into the social dynamics of the group. It becomes attached to status, as in chimps, or the act is offered outside of reproductive purposes purely to serve social relationships, as in bonobos. At the level of culture, sex deepens even further in its manifestation among self-conscious persons. Symbolic communication opens intersubjective channels for a novel kind of immediacy and intimacy between egoic individuals unseen in the animal world. The complexities of language allow the idiosyncratic nature of personality to become a factor in selection. Brains, and not just brawn, become important. In colloquial terms, animal lust is overlaid with human love, such that a profound reciprocity of mutual care and satisfaction can now exist. Sex attains a spiritual depth, but it is also refracted through cultural taboos and societal norms. The typical physical sex distinctions of animals, male-female, get an overlay of cultural gender constructs, masculine-feminine, performed or subverted differently across contexts. Sex can be play, punishment, heaven or hell, rape or rapture. In short, the meaning of sex to a human in the 21st century is quite different compared to that of, say, a dandelion, despite the continuity of the mechanism. Indeed, not only are there successive layerings of neuronal and symbolic information from the mind and culture levels, respectively, there are also intracultural layerings, as human symbolic learning has shifted cultural perceptions of sexuality over the millennia. Sex means something different to a postmodern woman than to a woman in a Neolithic forager society, a woman in a traditional agricultural society, etc. That it is meaningful has not changed. Only how it is meaningful has evolved. On the other end of the spectrum, annihilation can be addressed in similar terms. For matter, annihilation is simply the binary 0 to generations 1. Stars explode with all the mute indifference with which they form. Entropy is simply the way of things. For cellular life, waging its war against entropy, annihilation means death, its antithetical goal state. For cells, the avoidance of death is a reflex, an unconscious reaction triggered by a stimulus. The amoeba tracks to the left when it bumps up against a destructive chemical on its right. When dissolution does come, the specific system is lost, but near identical copies exist elsewhere. So life flourishes unconsciously and disappears into darkness just as unawares. For animals, death is profoundly different. Confronted by danger, there are feelings of fear, stress, and terror. An animal will struggle violently to preserve itself. All instincts marshal to survive. When death is finally imminent, it is painful. From the intimation to the wound to the final undoing, all qualia are negative. The animal suffers. Once dead, the unique aspect of that being, the product of all its experience, is lost to the world. Some social animals like apes and elephants seem to recognize this and appear to mourn in their way the unique character that has been lost. On the plane of culture, all of this is only heightened by symbolic thought and action. Death is mediated by ritual, by grief, by concepts of afterlife and ancestor worship. Death can mean a great deal, depending on the cultural overlay of interpretation. An individual not only experiences death but can also reflect upon it. Indeed, the prospect of death can terrify a human entirely in the abstract when no specific danger is imminent at all. One can wallow in the dread and uncertainty of it, and even consider inflicting it on oneself. One can ask, to be or not to be? One can be oppressed by the weight of the realization that all that is living must die, and persist in the torment of the ever-grinning skull latent in every pleasure. A person can also heroically face this inevitability with courage or acts of self-sacrifice. Aware of suffering, one can seek its mitigation in the world. One can apply one's thought to reduce death and negative valence. People can also rationally accept death, come to peace with it as no other animal can. They can access and assess the sum total of their experience and conclude, amidst the pain of disillusion, that it was all worth it. Humans can thus go gentle or not into that good night, forking lightning as best they can with their allotted time. They can imagine heavens and Hades of every stripe, which ease their passing and gesture to a viability beyond the physical. But humans do pass, and the patterned information of the infinite richness of their egos is experienced no more by those that they leave behind. Death is thus bitterest for the most complex beings who have the depth of consciousness to taste the nuanced flavors of its bitterness. Death is the last enemy, but also the mother of beauty. A complex issue indeed. Thus, from fundamental thermodynamic laws, we see the blossoming of ever richer phenomena through novel information processing. This is how meaning evolves. In that evolution, we can find both continuity and discontinuity. New layers are not reducible to lower ones, but do build off of them. There is a thread connecting the chaotic dissolution of a whirlpool and Hamlet reflecting on the undiscovered country. It is a tenuous thread, but it meanders the labyrinth of complexity as surely as Ariadne's. In the symphonic opera of existence, meanings are the leitmotifs, appearing soft and solo at the first, then rising, growing, getting contrapuntal harmonies and spreading through the orchestra until the single melody that broke the silence thunders with a swell of ecstasy, sublimity, and awe that goes past our words. The theme of that symphony is what we call the sacred. The sacred. According to the concept of meaning and value advanced over the preceding pages, complex entities strive to update their world models through learning, which provides them the relevant information they need to orient their actions toward optimal goal states. As they do, meaningful knowledge is attained that permits the achievement of still greater levels of complexity, and so on. This process plays out in human culture through the development of symbolic meaning sharing, which is a form of semantic information processing able to intersubjectively cohere large groups of individuals in a symbolic world dedicated to achieving collective goals. As meaningful knowledge is learned by people in societies, it is symbolically translated and culturally affirmed, whereupon it serves to inform future action and collective organization. Sense for meaning is thus cultivated among a society's members, a honing of predictive accuracy in the direction established by earlier successes as new information is continually compared against the proven templates of a society's established meanings. Language allows these established meanings to be reified and reflected upon, and through collective cultural memory these meanings are stored and transmitted to new generations across time via the enculturation process discussed above. Such meanings will naturally vary in their cultural significance relative to how important they have been for steering society toward continued or enhanced viability. Novel and unfamiliar concepts and behaviors will face, if not ambivalence, perhaps only mild curiosity. More established lodestars will receive varying degrees of regard. But for the learned meanings established as absolutely fundamental to orienting a society toward locally optimal states, there will be a special reverence, care, and devotion. Such meanings we call sacred, and it is according to their gold standard that all other collective meanings and justifications are weighed and assessed. The sacred, then, can be understood as both the symbolic repository of a culture's most proven meanings and values, as well as the informing template or ideal by means of which people assess novel information for meaning. Cultural memory serves, you could say, as a transpersonally aggregated world model by means of which enculturated individuals learn to predict meaning. Embodied predictive processing of cultural meaning with the greatest causal power manifests as intuitions of sacredness. Over time, such collective learning carves out a hierarchy of values relative to the specific environmental conditions of the society. Like the formation of a neural network, the most successful meanings and values become well-trodden and robust, and get deposited into the symbolic social repository as sacred beliefs. The less established exploratory pathways remain weak, and could as easily lead to failure as to new, more successful beliefs. Symbolic learning is the process by which cultures update their collective world models toward more viable beliefs, in the course of which the sacred itself is updated. Because the sacred is both what is updated as well as the guide to more robust meaning, there is both disruption and continuity in this learning process. The sacred does not just change, it develops. This book series is an attempt to chart that development. I will use the word sacred, then, to refer to those collective representations of a culture that are superlatively meaningful to it, in the technical sense of meaning as mutual information with causal power bearing upon viability. The sacred constitutes the veritable foundation upon which the psychocultural flourishing depends. It hallows that which sustains and upholds a given society, enshrining the established gains of cognition and conception that make any continued gains possible. It is the proper respect owed to the adaptive path taken, its active shoring up, and the intimation of where it will lead based on where it has been. It is, in short, what is deemed the most important to the continued viability of a successful human system-environment relationship. One glimpses this sense even in colloquial uses of the word, as the sacred has been extended beyond traditional religious discourse into other domains of cultural significance. A cathedral or mosque is readily admitted to be a sacred place for religious practitioners, of course, but a secular nation's capital and its seat of democratic governance is also said to be sacred. Human rights and freedoms are likewise sacred in this modern sense. But so too is a tribe's totem or initiation rite sacred to its members. For those sensitive to ecology and the dynamic systems that render all life possible, nature and the biosphere are held as well as sacred. When threatened or attacked, these sites of the sacred will be adamantly defended by their acolytes like white blood cells warding off disease. That is because without the sacred, the psychosocial superorganism would break down. A tribe depends on its totems, religious communities on their gods, modern secular nation-states on their democratic ideals and institutions. They are what ground and orient such societies at their varying levels of size and complexity. They are what keep them from entropic dissolution, as well as what propel them toward still greater integrity and scope. As meaningful information, the sacred also complexifies through symbolic learning. In fact, its informational richness increases in tandem with the society's causal power, as it both permits and demands greater energetic input to sustain itself in the face of entropic dissolution. In this sense, the sacred itself is a kind of dissipative structure, a self-organizing informational configuration far from equilibrium in continual exchange with the environment. One might call this a thermodynamic theory of the sacred. Like all dissipative structures, the sacred complexifies by means of learning, and on the plane of culture, this learning is accomplished by individual members of society. As human minds complexify through learning, allowing more information to be related and coordinated, meaningful knowledge increases, and the comprehensive scope and coherence of the sacred expands accordingly. The world model extends its horizons. The causal connections between phenomena grow more refined. The profundity of explanatory patterns deepens. The resolution of thought becomes sharper, more nuanced, more fine-grained. Entirely new superlatives of normativity come into view. What is best, highest, greatest, most important, most true, most real are articulated with more clarity and inclusivity. In the process, the prevailing sense of the ultimate becomes successively contingent relative to something more ultimate still, and the sacred outgrows itself. Given how important, and indeed meaningful, this process is, we may wish to appreciate the learning process itself as sacred. Or, because it is what gives rise to sacred content, perhaps even as a sort of meta-sacred phenomenon. Learning is the means by which the sacred emerges and develops. After all, it is particularly in moments of breakthrough, of transcendence, of insight, that the sacred is experientially encountered. This is how new depths of meaning get disclosed. Such instances of adaptive learning mark advances into the unknown, a relatively chaotic realm of possibility whose increased entropy does not ultimately disrupt coherence, but actually enhances it by the disclosure of still greater structure operating with greater degrees of freedom. But that, you will note, is what complexification is. We might suggest, then, that learning is the archetypal act of transcendence. It is what complexifies the mind, permitting an updating of the world model according to which cultural meaning is reassessed. This meta-sacred act transcends any contextual sacred, for example, a totem, a church, for it is the very pattern by which the sacred manifests and develops. Indeed, it is perhaps only because every instance of the sacred is itself a product of this general process that instances of the sacred can serve as a reliable canon by which to interpret novel information. As we shall see, aspects of this metasacred process wind up imprinted in specific sacred contents across the complexification process. Some things register as meaningful precisely because they gesture toward the meaning-developing process itself. We can thus appreciate that something deeper than the sacred underlies the development of the sacred, something more important than any local realization of importance. Predictive processing models of cognition may be indicative of this, as they suggest that it is updating our sense of meaning that is actually most meaningful to us. We operate off prior information to make predictions, and if that information proves reliable, it is meaningful for us in the sense of maintaining our viability. But successful predictions are boring by design. All is going very well viability-wise if we experience very little surprise. It means the model is holding. By contrast, it is when we are confronted by new information which may stand to profoundly upgrade the quality of our priors that we become engrossed, transfixed, curious, amazed. As we will see, awe is itself a product of the learning process, a state of wonder aroused by the attempt to integrate a surplus of potentially meaningful information. The experience of meaning as profound relevance, as salience, as significance, this arises not so much from any established sacred per se, but from the meta-sacred call to learn, to complexify, to transcend, and update one's conception of the sacred thereby. New forms of the sacred always lie on the other side of awe. Awe is the metasacred response to information we have not yet processed for its sacrality. It is the mind's reflex before the invitation to transcendence. It is the liminal state beyond one's old concept of the sacred and before a new one. It is the blissful, open receptivity to an upgrade for one's meaning-making. It is the condition in which one meets such benevolent chaos as reorganizes you for the better, an incomprehensible fullness appreciated by the mystics as the mystery. All learning strives to render it known, and all learning ultimately falls short. What it produces is a series of ultimates, progressively approximating more and more of that abyss of meaning. These are the faces of God as they get redrawn through advances in symbolic learning. The evolution of meaning has thus been characterized by a succession of increasingly comprehensive and complex articulations of the sacred, to which human minds have transcended by reaching ever higher levels of informational integration and hierarchical coordination. Like other informational structures moving further from equilibrium, the configurational organization of the sacred has undergone a series of phase shifts across human cultural history. A punctuated equilibrium of different states reaching new degrees of complexity as more energy enters the system and organizes what it flows through. The substrate of this complex adaptive system is not some tangible solid or liquid, but the psychocultural system of information processing known as human society itself. The attractors to which it is drawn therefore correlate to the ways that human minds learn to process symbolic information at higher levels of complexity. Meaning and the sacred emerge and evolve out of the learning mind's distinct umwelts as it progressively renders more of the mystery known. In this way, knowledge and value extend in a graded continuum through the learning process of complexification. Feuerbach's insight that each plant would declare its own flower the most beautiful captures this transjective nature of relative good matching relative understanding. But being himself a theologian, Feuerbach took the idea even further, seeing that every entity must then have its own sort of guiding ideal, its own sacred, shaped by what we can now call the normative conditions of its entity-field relationship. If God were an object to the bird, he writes, he would be a winged being. The bird knows nothing higher, nothing more blissful than the winged condition. There is, we might say, a God for every umwelt, since meaning is adjudicated according to the information linking systems to their environment. This line of thought leads Feuerbach to posit that the God concept is itself always but a given entity's intimation of ultimate knowledge. God is thy highest idea, the supreme effort of thy understanding, thy highest power of thought. God is what the understanding thinks as the highest. But in what I perceive to be essential is revealed the nature of my understanding, is shown the power of my thinking faculty. As thou thinkest God, such is thy thought. The measure of thy God is the measure of thy understanding. As we shall see, though, a word like God is probably better reserved in reference to a particular cultural umwelt's conception of the sacred. God, at least as an anthropomorphic supernatural being, is but one shape assumed by the sacred in cultural history, a moment in the complexification of meaning's ultimate concern. However, those who use the word God to refer to more abstract notions, such as Paul Tillich's ultimate concern, would be employing the term more as I am using the sacred. I myself will sometimes speak of God in this way, not as any given moment in the evolution of the sacred, but as the enduring entity being evolved. Indeed, over the following pages I mean to show how God in this broader sense has evolved, complexifying through the learning process of cultural evolution. Once we are familiar with the distinct patterns of ontogenetic learning, which the next book will explore, and understand why and how they shape entire collective justification systems discussed over the two subsequent books, we will be ready to track the evolution of meaning, value, and the sacred as they developed across human cultural history. After 13.8 billion years of cosmic complexification, during which meaning itself was slowly growing more intricate and profound, the sacred at last emerged, full force, in human culture, where God awakened in the mind of mankind. From structural to genetic to cognitive to symbolic learning, we come at last to the flower of evolution and consider the unfolding of sacred meaning in the human cultural domain. That will be the focus of our attention going forward.